In the grand theater of world literature, few adventures shine as brilliantly as those we bring to life. Here on Echoes of Stories. Tonight, the shadows lift, unveiling one of the greatest tales ever written, The Count of Monte Cristo by the legendary Alexandre Dumas. First published in serial form in 1844, this timeless masterpiece has captured hearts for generations, weaving a story of betrayal, vengeance, and redemption. The version you're about to experience comes from the public domain archives of Project Gutenberg, faithfully preserved for all who seek its magic. And now, let the journey unfold. This is The Count of Monte Cristo, Episode 2. The morning sun rose in a clear, golden blaze, its rays scattering across the water and weaving the foam into a glittering web of ruby light. On the second floor of La Reserve, in the arbor already familiar to the reader, the wedding feast had been prepared. The large, bright room chosen for the celebration had several wide windows, each crowned with the golden-lettered name of one of France's great cities, though no one could quite explain the reason. A long wooden balcony stretched beneath these windows, running the full length of the house. Although the festivities were set to begin at noon, by 11 the balcony was already crowded with eager guests, favored members of the pharaoh's crew and close friends of the groom, all dressed in their finest clothing to honor the day. There was talk among them that the owners of the pharaoh might attend the feast, but most doubted such an unusual gesture would truly happen. Danglars soon appeared, with Chatteris at his side, and confirmed the rumor. He claimed to have spoken directly with M. Morel, who promised to dine at La Reserve. Moments later, M. Morel himself arrived, greeted by loud cheers from the sailors. His presence seemed a sign that Edmond would soon be named captain, and as the young man was loved by all aboard the Pharaon, the crew's joy was without restraint. With M. Morel's arrival, Danglars and Chatteris hurried off to find the bridegroom and bring the news of this honored guest. They met the wedding party approaching, Edmond and Mercedes at the front, a small group of young women attending the bride, followed by Edmond's father. At the rear walked Fernand, his lips curved in a familiar but unsettling smile. Neither Edmond nor Mercedes noticed the expression. Their happiness left room for nothing but each other and the warmth of the day. The two messengers delivered their news and shook Edmond's hand warmly before falling in a step beside Fernand and the elder Dantès. The old man drew attention with his fine appearance, a suit of gleaming watered silk with polished steel buttons, clocked stockings of English make, and a tricorn hat adorned with white and blue ribbons. Leaning on a carved walking stick, his lined face shone with joy, recalling the fashionable gentleman who once strolled the gardens of the Luxembourg and Tuileries in 1796. Chatteris walked beside him, his eagerness for the feast outweighing the faint, blurred memory of the previous night's events. Danglars exchanged a meaningful glance with Fernand, who followed the happy couple in pale silence, occasionally flushing or tensing as if bracing for something imminent. His eyes kept straying toward Marseilles with restless anticipation. Edmond wore the neat, functional attire of the merchant service, a blend of civilian and military style. His open, handsome face glowed with joy, the very image of youthful strength and beauty. Mercedes, radiant as the Greek women of Cyprus or Chios, moved with the free, graceful step of an Arlesin or Andalusian. Her dark eyes shone, and her smile invited everyone around to share her happiness. She carried no veil to hide her blushes, looking about as if to say, "Rejoice with me, for I am truly happy." When the party reached La Reserve, M. Morel came down to meet them, joined by soldiers and sailors to whom he repeated his promise that Edmond would succeed the late Captain Leclerc. At his approach, Edmond placed Mercedes' arm in his patron's, who led her up the wooden steps toward the prepared room. The guests followed close behind, the balcony creaking under their combined weight. Inside, Mercedes stopped at the center of the long table, asking her father-in-law-to-be to sit at her right and placing Fernand at her left as if he were a brother. The choice struck Fernand like a wound. His face drained of color, and beneath his dark skin the blood retreated sharply. On the opposite side, Edmond seated his most honored guests, M. Morel to his right, Danglars to his left, the others arranging themselves as they pleased. Servants began to pass the delicacies, dark, spiced sausages from Alls, bright red lobsters, large, jewel-colored prawns, sea urchins with their spiny shells hiding tender flesh, and Clovis, prized in the south as sweeter even than northern oysters. These were the fruits of the sea, offered by the shore's bounty. The elder Dantès, raising a glass of wine as golden as topaz, remarked on the quiet in the room, as if surprised such a merry gathering could be so subdued. Catullus observed that marriage did not always make a man feel entirely lighthearted. Edmond admitted his joy was so great that it subdued him, pressing on the heart almost like sorrow might. Danglars studied Fernand's tense expression, while Edmond insisted there was something almost unsettling about such perfect happiness, as though it must be guarded like a fairy tale palace, surrounded by dangers to be overcome. He spoke humbly of feeling unworthy of the honor of marrying Mercedes. Catullus reminded him, with a teasing smile, that the wedding was not yet complete, and Mercedes blushed while Fernand grew increasingly agitated, wiping perspiration from his brow. Edmond brushed off the remark, pointing to his watch. In only an hour and a half, he said, the mayor of Marseilles would be waiting to unite them. Thanks to M. Morel's influence, all formal delays had been removed. The table reacted with surprised exclamations, except for the elder Dantès, who laughed heartily. Mercedes looked pleased, while Fernand gripped his knife in a sudden spasm. Danglars, pale, asked how the arrangement had been made, and Edmond explained that at 2:30, Mercedes would become Madame Dantès. Fernand closed his eyes, a wave of heat sweeping across his brow. His hands gripped the table for support, preventing him from collapsing. Despite every effort to mask his turmoil, a deep groan escaped him, though it vanished in the midst of the guests' loud congratulations. The elder among them remarked on how swiftly the events had unfolded, arriving only the morning before and now, by mid-afternoon, married. To him, it was the kind of efficiency only a sailor could achieve. Danglars, speaking with quiet hesitation, wondered how the formalities had been managed, the contract, the settlement. Edmond, in light-hearted good humor, had explained that neither he nor Mercedes possessed a fortune, so the paperwork had been swift and inexpensive. This drew fresh laughter from the group. What they had believed to be merely a betrothal feast, Danglars pointed out, had turned out to be the actual wedding celebration. Edmond assured them otherwise, saying that he would be traveling to Paris the next morning on business, returning by the 1st of March, and that the true wedding feast would be held the very next day after his return. This promise of another celebration lifted the spirits of the gathering even higher. The elder Dantès, who earlier had noted the quiet mood at the beginning of the meal, now struggled to find a moment of calm amid the clamor to toast the couple's happiness. Edmond responded to his father's affectionate eagerness with a look of gratitude, while Mercedes, glancing at the clock, gave Edmond a gentle reminder with a meaningful gesture. Around the table, the easy, unrestrained joy of people free from formal etiquette filled the air. Those who had not found their preferred seats earlier now rose and sought more agreeable company. Everyone seemed to speak at once, content to share their own thoughts without waiting for replies. The pallor on Fernand's face seemed to seep into Danglars as well. Fernand himself appeared to suffer an inner torment, restless and unable to remain seated. He was among the first to leave the table, walking in silence toward the far end of the room as if trying to escape the cheerful noise. Catullus moved toward him just as Danglars, whom Fernand seemed most intent on avoiding, joined them in a quiet corner. Catullus, warmed by the wine and softened by Edmond's kindness earlier, found himself speaking well of the young man. He thought it would have been a great pity to have gone through with the scheme they had discussed the previous day. Danglars, feigning reassurance, claimed there had never been serious intent, and that Fernand had mastered his emotions so well that any concerns had faded. He remarked that giving up such a beautiful bride was no small sacrifice, calling Edmond a fortunate man and half joking that he wished he could take his place. Mercedes' gentle voice reminded Edmond of the time. They were expected elsewhere in just 15 minutes. Edmond rose eagerly, ready to leave, and the whole party echoed his enthusiasm with cheers. It was then that Danglars, who had been closely watching Fernand, saw him stagger and collapse backward onto a seat near an open window. At the same moment, faint sounds rose from the stairs, measured footsteps, the metallic clink of swords and military gear, followed by the low murmur of many voices, loud enough to dull the room's laughter. An uneasy stillness settled over the gathering. The sounds grew nearer. 3 heavy knocks rattled the door. Guests looked at one another in alarm. A commanding voice demanded entry in the name of the law. The door opened to reveal a magistrate wearing his official sash, accompanied by a corporal and 4 soldiers. The cheerful atmosphere gave way to dread. Immoral, recognizing the magistrate, stepped forward, assuming it must be a mistake that could be easily resolved. The magistrate assured him that if it were, it would be quickly corrected, but explained that he carried an order of arrest and must fulfill his duty. He asked who among them was Edmond Dantès. All eyes turned toward the young man. Though shaken, Edmond stepped forward with calm dignity and identified himself, asking the reason for his arrest. The magistrate could not yet disclose the details, saying that they would be revealed during the preliminary examination. Immoral, realizing that resistance would be futile, accepted the authority before him. Old Dantès, however, could not. A father's heart refused to understand. He pleaded earnestly for his son's release, his words so moving that even the officer softened. The man suggested it was likely only a matter of incomplete paperwork regarding the ship's cargo or health records, and that Edmond would probably be freed quickly once the matter was clarified. Meanwhile, Catullus, frowning, turned to Danglars for an explanation. Danglars claimed ignorance, looking as bewildered as anyone. Catullus searched for Fernand, but he had vanished. The events of the previous night came rushing back to Catullus with startling clarity. It now seemed obvious to him that this arrest was tied to the plot discussed earlier. He accused Danglars in a rough, choked voice of carrying out the scheme, calling it an ill turn that deserved double misfortune for those behind it. Danglars insisted he had no part in it, reminding Catullus that he had torn up the incriminating paper. Catullus, however, remembered seeing it tossed aside, not destroyed. Danglars dismissed his words, pointing out that he had been drunk at the time. When Catullus pressed again, asking about Fernand's whereabouts, Danglars claimed not to know, suggesting he had wisely gone to mind his own affairs. For now, Danglars said, their concern should be with finding a way to help their unfortunate friend. After exchanging warm handshakes with his sympathetic friends, Edmond Dantès calmly surrendered himself to the officers sent to arrest him. He assured those gathered that there was merely a small misunderstanding to clear up, perhaps one that would not even require him to reach the prison before being resolved. Danglars, stepping closer to the group, agreed aloud that it was likely nothing more than a mistake. Descending the staircase, Dantès was led by the magistrate, soldiers following behind. Outside, a carriage stood waiting. He entered, accompanied by 2 guards and the magistrate, and the vehicle set off toward Marseilles. From the balcony above, Mercedes called out to him, her voice trembling with heartbreak. Dantès, hearing her cry, leaned from the carriage to reassure her that they would meet again soon, before the coach vanished around the bend of Fort St. Nicholas. Immoral urged those remaining to wait for him. He promised to take the first available transport to Marseilles and return with news. Encouraged by the group, he left swiftly. What followed was a heavy silence. Mercedes and the elder Dantès stood apart, each lost in their own grief, until at last they turned to one another and embraced in mutual sorrow. Fernand entered quietly, poured himself a glass of water with a trembling hand, drank, and sat down, by chance, beside Mercedes, who had collapsed, half fainting, after being released from the old man's arms. Instinctively, Fernand shifted his chair away. Catullus, who had been watching Fernand closely, whispered to Danglars that he was certain Fernand was behind the tragedy. Danglars dismissed the idea, saying Fernand lacked the wit for such a scheme, though he hoped that whoever was responsible would face the consequences. The conversation turned to speculation about the arrest. Some suggested contraband goods might have been found aboard the ship. Danglars admitted that he only knew what he had been told about the cargo, cotton from Alexandria and Smyrna, though the elder Dantès recalled that his son had mentioned bringing home a small case of coffee and another of tobacco. Danglars seized on this, suggesting customs officers must have discovered them during a search. Mercedes paid no attention to this theory. Her grief, until then restrained, broke out into violent sobbing. The old man tried to comfort her, but his hopeful words were echoed with doubt by Danglars and Fernand. A voice from the balcony interrupted. The lookout had spotted Immoral returning. Everyone rushed to hear his report, but his pale face told the truth before his words did. The matter was more serious than expected. Mercedes cried out Edmond's innocence. Immoral agreed, but revealed the charge, acting as an agent of the Bonapartist faction. The old man collapsed into a chair. Catullus turned on Danglars, accusing him of playing the trick he had hinted at the night before. But Danglars warned him to stay quiet for his own safety. He reminded Catullus that Dantès had stopped at the island of Elba and spent a day there, enough to arouse suspicion if any compromising documents were found. Reluctantly, Catullus agreed to wait and see what would happen, and the two left together. Fernand then stepped forward as Mercedes' self-proclaimed protector, leading her home, while friends of Dantès carried his nearly lifeless father to the Allies de Mailhan. Word of Edmond's arrest spread quickly through the city. On his way back to the port to seek news from him, de Villefort, the deputy prosecutor, Immoral encountered Danglars and Catullus. He asked if they could believe such an accusation. Danglars replied that he had already considered Dantès' visit to Elba suspicious, but claimed to have told no one else, saying he feared harming both Dantès and Immoral due to the shipowner's family ties to the previous government. Immoral praised Danglars for his discretion, even revealing that he had considered his interests should Dantès become captain. Danglars pretended surprise and learned that Dantès had no personal objection to him, only a vague reference to some past incident. Under his breath, Danglars muttered his contempt. The conversation then turned to business. With the Pharaoh now without a captain, Danglars offered to take temporary command until Dantès' release, which Morel approved. Danglars asked if they would be allowed to visit Dantès, but Immoral explained he would first speak with M. de Villefort and try to plead Edmond's case, despite Villefort's strong royalist views. Danglars hinted that ambition might outweigh mercy, but Immoral preferred to reserve judgment, sending Danglars back to the ship while he went to seek an audience with the magistrate. With that, the determined shipowner left the two conspirators behind and made his way toward the Palais de Justice. Danglars turned to Catullus, reflecting on how events had unfolded, and questioned whether there was still any will to defend Edmond. Catullus admitted there was none, yet confessed it seemed a terrible thing that what began as nothing more than a jest had now led to such serious consequences. Danglars reminded him that the true instigator was neither of them, but Fernand. He explained that he had discarded the paper in a corner of the room, even thinking it destroyed. Catullus recalled clearly seeing it crushed and forgotten in a corner of the arbor. From this, Danglars reasoned that Fernand must have taken it, perhaps even sending the original without the trouble of rewriting it, the disguised handwriting shielding Danglars from suspicion. He insisted that he had never believed Dantès guilty of any conspiracy, considering the whole matter to be a harmless prank, until it now seemed he had stumbled upon something more dangerous than intended. Catullus expressed deep regret, wishing he had played no part in it, and feared the outcome might bring misfortune to them both. But Danglars dismissed such concerns, claiming that any blame should rest solely on Fernand. Their safety, he said, depended on complete silence, speaking to no one, and letting the matter fade away without touching them. Catullus ended the conversation with a brief gesture of farewell, heading toward the Allées de Mailhan. His steps were slow, his head shifting from side to side, his lips moving with a restless muttering of one consumed by a single thought. Danglars, left alone, considered how well matters had gone according to his design. For the moment, he held command of the Pharaon, with the prospect of keeping it permanently if Catullus could be persuaded to remain quiet. Only one concern remained, the possibility of Dantès' release. Yet Danglars consoled himself with the thought that Edmond was now in the grasp of justice, and that justice, as always, would follow her own course. Satisfied with this, he stepped into a waiting boat and ordered the rowers to take him aboard the Pharaon, where Immoral had agreed to meet him. Immoral praised Danglars for his discretion, even revealing that he had considered his interests should Dantès become captain. Danglars pretended surprise and learned that Dantès had no personal objection to him, only a vague reference to some past incident. Under his breath, Danglars muttered his contempt. The conversation then turned to business. With the Pharaon now without a captain, Danglars offered to take temporary command until Dantès' release, which Morel approved. Danglars asked if they would be allowed to visit Dantès, but Immoral explained he would first speak with him, de Villefort, and try to plead Edmond's case, despite Villefort's strong royalist views. Danglars hinted that ambition might outweigh mercy, but Immoral preferred to reserve judgment, sending Danglars back to the ship while he went to seek an audience with the magistrate. With that, the determined shipowner left the two conspirators behind and made his way toward the Palais de Justice. Danglars turned to Catullus, reflecting on how events had unfolded, and questioned whether there was still any will to defend Edmond. Catullus admitted there was none, yet confessed it seemed a terrible thing that what began as nothing more than a jest had now led to such serious consequences. Danglars reminded him that the true instigator was neither of them, but Fernand. He explained that he had discarded the paper in a corner of the room, even thinking it destroyed. Catullus recalled clearly seeing it crushed and forgotten in a corner of the arbor. From this, Danglars reasoned that Fernand must have taken it, perhaps even sending the original without the trouble of rewriting it, the disguised handwriting shielding Danglars from suspicion. He insisted that he had never believed Dantès guilty of any conspiracy, considering the whole matter to be a harmless prank, until it now seemed he had stumbled upon something more dangerous than intended. Catullus expressed deep regret, wishing he had played no part in it, and feared the outcome might bring misfortune to them both. But Danglars dismissed such concerns, claiming that any blame should rest solely on Fernand. Their safety, he said, depended on complete silence, speaking to no one, and letting the matter fade away without touching them. Catullus ended the conversation with a brief gesture of farewell, heading toward the Allées de Mailhan. His steps were slow, his head shifting from side to side, his lips moving with a restless muttering of one consumed by a single thought. Danglars, left alone, considered how well matters had gone according to his design. For the moment, he held command of the pharaoh, with the prospect of keeping it permanently if Catullus could be persuaded to remain quiet. Only one concern remained, the possibility of Dante's release. Yet Danglars consoled himself with the thought that Edmond was now in the grasp of justice, and that justice, as always, would follow her own course. Satisfied with this, he stepped into a waiting boat and ordered the rowers to take him aboard the Pharaon, where M. Morel had agreed to meet him. In one of the stately mansions crafted by Puget along the Rue du Grand Cours, directly across from the Medusa Fountain, a second wedding celebration was taking place, almost at the same time as the feast in honor of Dantès. The occasion was similar, yet the gathering itself was very different. Instead of sailors, soldiers, and those from the humblest walks of life, this company represented the very elite of Marseilles. Magistrates who had stepped down during the usurper's reign, officers who had abandoned the imperial army to join forces with Condé, and younger members of noble families raised to despise the man who exile had turned into a martyr and restoration would later elevate into an idol. The guests were still seated at the table. Conversations flowed with heat and energy, revealing the deep passions and resentments that gripped the people of the South, passions sharpened by centuries of religious conflict that had only fueled political division. The emperor, now reduced to ruling the small island of Elba, after having held dominion over half the world, found himself the sovereign of a mere few thousand souls. Once greeted by cries of Vive Napoleon from more than 100 million people in many tongues, he was now viewed here as a ruined figure, forever cut off from France and her throne. The magistrates debated politics openly. The military men recalled Moscow and Leipzig, and the women discussed Josephine's divorce. Their joy was not so much over Napoleon's personal fall as it was over the defeat of the Napoleonic vision itself, a defeat that, for them, promised a bright revival of political life. An elderly man, wearing the cross of St. Louis, rose to propose a toast to King Louis XVIII. This was the Marquis de Saint-Méran. The mention of the king, linked to memories of patient exile at Hartwell and the image of a peace-loving monarch, sparked a wave of enthusiasm. Glasses were raised in the English style, and the ladies, plucking flowers from their own bodices, scattered them across the table in a display of almost poetic fervor. Among the gathering, the Marquise de Saint-Méran, her gaze stern and commanding despite the noble elegance that still lingered at her age, remarked on how the revolutionaries had driven her class from their possessions, only to buy them cheaply during the Reign of Terror. She believed that their own loyalty to a fallen monarch, at great personal cost, proved that true devotion had been on their side. To her, the man they had sacrificed for remained Louis the Well-Beloved, while the usurper was nothing but a lasting curse. She turned to Villefort, expecting his agreement, but found him distracted. The old Marquis gently teased that politics were hardly the best topic for a wedding day. Renée, the young bride with light brown hair and eyes like liquid crystal, admitted she had been keeping Villefort engaged in her own conversation. She returned him to her mother, who repeated her view that the Bonapartists lacked sincerity, passion, and loyalty. Villefort acknowledged that they possessed something else entirely, fanaticism, likening Napoleon to a Western prophet whose followers saw him as both lawgiver and the embodiment of equality. The Marquis scoffed at the idea of Napoleon as a symbol of equality, pointing instead to Robespierre, while Villefort placed each figure on a symbolic pedestal, Robespierre on the scaffold, Napoleon atop the Place Vendôme column, seeing one kind of equality as elevating, the other as degrading. He argued that both men had been dangerous revolutionaries, and that their respective downfalls were blessings for France, though such figures always retained followers, just as Cromwell had in his day. The Marquise accused him of speaking like a revolutionary, reminding him of his father's Girondin roots. Villefort's expression darkened as he clarified that his father had not voted for the king's death and had nearly shared the Marquise's own family's fate during the Reign of Terror. She acknowledged the shared suffering, but pointed out that their families had done so for opposite political reasons. Her family loyal to the exiled princes, his quick to align with the new order. Renée urged her mother to set aside such bitter memories, and Villefort added his own plea, asking that the past remain buried. He explained that he had distanced himself from his father's politics, abandoning the name Noirtier in favor of Villefort, choosing to grow as a separate branch from the old revolutionary trunk. The Marquis applauded his words, seeing hope for true reconciliation. The Marquise agreed, promising to forget the past on the condition that Villefort remained steadfast in royalist loyalty. She reminded him that the king's forgiveness was given on their recommendation, and that his duty to punish political offenders would be all the greater given his family's history. Villefort assured her that his role and the troubled times demanded severity, noting that he had already prosecuted several cases to their conclusion. Yet he feared unrest was far from over. Napoleon's presence on Elba was too close, keeping his supporters' hopes alive. Marseilles was crowded with half-pay officers who, on the slightest excuse, clashed with royalists. Duels among the upper classes, violent assaults among the lower. At this point, the Comte de Salvieux, an old friend of the Marquis and chamberlain to the Comte d'Artois, observed that the Holy Alliance was considering removing Napoleon from the island. The conversation turned to news from Paris. The Marquis de Saint-Méran recalled hearing that plans were being made for Napoleon's removal. The destination, it seemed, was the distant island of St. Helena. The Marquise, unfamiliar with the name, learned it was far across the equator, some 2,000 leagues away. She considered it far better that such a man be placed at so great a distance, rather than left between Corsica, where he was born, and Naples, where his brother-in-law was king, staring across the waters at Italy, whose crown he had once desired for his son. Villefort observed that the treaties of 1814 stood in the way of any direct action, for to move against Napoleon would break those compacts. The Comte de Salvieux brushed aside such concerns, remarking that treaties had not hindered the decision to execute the Duc d'Enghien. The Marquise felt that with the Holy Alliance's help, France would soon be rid of Napoleon, and trusted Villefort to cleanse Marseilles of his remaining supporters. To her, the king was either sovereign or nothing at all, and to keep him secure, only the most unyielding agents should be used to stamp out conspiracies before they could grow. Villefort, however, noted that the law rarely acted until an offense had already occurred, and that afterwards, it could only punish, not prevent. The Comte de Salvieux's young daughter, dear friend to Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, expressed a curious wish. She hoped some notable trial might take place during her stay in Marseilles, as she had never seen a court of law and had been told it was highly entertaining. Villefort explained that while it could indeed be compelling, it was a different sort of drama than one found in the theater. In court, the distress was real. The accused, pale and agitated, did not go home when the performance ended, but was instead taken back to prison and perhaps into the hands of the executioner. Such scenes, he warned, were not for the faint-hearted, though he promised that if an appropriate case arose, he would offer her the chance to attend. Renée, unsettled by his words, noted how he seemed to find amusement in the thought. Villefort replied that his profession often demanded such severity. He had pronounced death sentences more than once in political cases, and could not be certain how many might be waiting for the chance to strike back at him. He spoke of how a former soldier of Napoleon, trained to obey without hesitation, might find it easier to drive a dagger into a personal enemy than to charge an opposing army. For him, there was a strange energy in facing an accused person who feared his words. His pride lay in seeing the prisoner shaken and defeated by his argument. René could only suppress a startled sound at this revelation. Other guests praised his resolve, recalling past cases where his arguments had crushed the accused before the executioner's work was done. René admitted that for those guilty of crimes such as parricide, the punishment seemed fitting enough, but she felt pity for those caught in political intrigue. Villefort countered that such acts were the gravest offenses, for the king was the father of his people, and conspiring against him was a form of parricide on a vast scale. René reminded him of his promise to show mercy to those for whom she pleaded, and he assured her, with a gentle smile, that he would always consult her before deciding. The Marquise urged her daughter to tend to her doves, her dogs, and her embroidery, leaving political matters to those who understood them. Villefort responded with a courteous nod, recalling the old Latin maxim that arms must yield to the robe of justice. René confessed her lingering wish that he had chosen another profession, perhaps medicine, as the idea of a destroying angel always unsettled her. Villefort looked at her with quiet tenderness, while the Marquis expressed the hope that he might serve as the moral and political physician of the province. The Marquise, still unable to resist, added that such service would help erase the memory of his father's past. Villefort replied with a measured smile that his father had, he hoped, abandoned those errors and was now a loyal friend to religion and order, perhaps even more staunch than his son, having something to atone for, while Villefort himself was moved purely by conviction and choice. He glanced around the table as if gauging the effect of his words, much as he might in a courtroom. The Comte de Salvieux then recalled telling the king's chamberlain how fitting the union was between the son of a former Girondin and the daughter of a Condé officer. The king himself, having overheard, had spoken warmly of Villefort, emphasizing his chosen name rather than that of Noirtier, praising his judgment, and expressing pleasure at his forthcoming marriage. Villefort could scarcely believe such words had been spoken by the monarch, but the Comte assured him they were true, adding that the Marquis could confirm the king had said the same to him months before when the match was first discussed. The Marquis confirmed the Comte's account, and Villefort's gratitude overflowed. He felt a deep sense of indebtedness to the gracious monarch and declared that there was nothing he would not do to prove his devotion. The Marquise, clearly pleased by this display of loyalty, remarked that a captured conspirator will be most welcome in his hands. René, however, quietly hoped such wishes would not be granted. She prayed that Providence would allow only petty offenders, unfortunate debtors, or minor swindlers to come before him, content that his work remained free of blood and treachery. Villefort compared her wish to asking that a physician be summoned only for mild headaches, childhood illnesses, or minor stings, instead of for the dangerous diseases whose cures brought the greatest honor. If he were to serve the king as public prosecutor, then grave and perilous cases must come his way. At that very moment, as though his words had summoned it, a servant entered and whispered something in Villefort's ear. He rose from the table and excused himself on the grounds of urgent business. When he returned shortly afterward, his expression was alight with satisfaction. René's gaze lingered on him with fond affection, for his refined and handsome features, now animated by a heightened energy, seemed to her worthy of admiration and pride. He explained that she had wished him a doctor instead of a lawyer, yet in one respect his life was already similar to that of a physician, unable to call any day his own, not even the day of his betrothal. Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran asked with concern why he had been called away. Villefort revealed that the matter was serious, one that might very well end beneath the blade of the executioner. René turned pale at the thought, and those close enough to hear reacted with astonishment. Villefort shared the information he had received. A possible Bonapartist conspiracy had been uncovered. The Marquise could scarcely believe it. He then read aloud the accusation he had been given, an unsigned letter claiming that Edmond Dantès, mate of the ship Pharaoh newly arrived from Smyrna after stopping at Naples and Portoferraggio, had carried a letter from Murat to the usurper and had taken charge of another letter from the usurper to a Bonapartist club in Paris. The anonymous writer alleged that arresting Dantès would confirm the charge, for the letter would be found either on his person, at his father's home, or in his cabin aboard the Pharaon. René pointed out that the letter, an unsigned scrap of accusation, was not even addressed to Villefort himself, but to the king's attorney. Villefort explained that the king's attorney was absent, and by his orders, the secretary had opened his letters. Finding this one of apparent importance, the secretary had sent for Villefort, and when he could not be found, had taken it upon himself to give the orders necessary for arresting the accused. The Marquise inquired whether the guilty person was already secured, but Villefort's betrothed gently corrected her mother, reminding her that guilt had not yet been proven. Villefort confirmed that the accused was indeed in safe custody, adding that if the incriminating letter was found, the man would not likely see freedom again, unless it was under the grim escort of the executioner. René asked where the unfortunate man was being held, and Villefort revealed that he was at his own house. The Marquise urged him not to linger when duty called, reminding him that as a servant of the king, he must go where service demanded. René, with hands clasped and a voice filled with earnest pleading, begged him to be merciful on the day of their betrothal. Villefort moved to her side, leaning over her chair with a tone meant to reassure her. He promised to show all the leniency in his power, yet warned that if the charges against this so-called Bonapartist hero proved correct, he would have no choice but to see the sentence carried out. At the mere mention of the fatal act, René shuddered, her delicate frame recoiling from the image. The Marquise dismissed her reaction as foolishness, assuring Villefort that her daughter would grow accustomed to such matters. She then offered him her dry, bony hand, which he kissed with the respect of son-in-law, though in his heart he wished it had been René's own hand he touched. René sighed that these were mournful omens for a day meant to celebrate their union, drawing an impatient rebuke from her mother, who could not see what connection existed between her daughter's tender feelings and affairs of state. Villefort asked that the Marquise forgive her daughter's lack of political loyalty, promising to balance it with his own inflexible severity. Yet as he cast an expressive glance at René, the look quietly conveyed that his justice would still be tempered with mercy for her sake. She answered with a gentle, approving smile, and with that silent exchange filling him with happiness, Villefort departed with a sense of paradise in his heart. The moment Villefort left the salon, his demeanor shifted into the grave composure of a man who holds another's fate in his hands. Though his face bore the nobility of one accustomed to authority, a look he had carefully perfected before the mirror, assuming the full severity of judicial command did not come naturally to him. In truth, only the memory of his father's political leanings, which could threaten his own career unless he acted with the utmost caution, tempered his mood. Otherwise, Gerard de Villefort was as content as a man could be. Already wealthy, he occupied a high official post at just 27. He was on the verge of marrying a charming young woman, not with a consuming passion, but with a measured affection befitting a deputy attorney of the king. Her beauty was undeniable, her family's political influence considerable, and her dowry an impressive 50,000 crowns, with the promise of a fortune swelling to 500,000 upon her father's passing. Such prospects filled Villefort with a dazzling sense of satisfaction. At the doorway, the sight of the waiting commissary of police brought him swiftly down from these lofty thoughts. His expression hardened into the role he meant to play, and he acknowledged that he had read the intercepted letter. The arrest, he agreed, had been the correct course, and he demanded to know what had been discovered about the man and the alleged conspiracy. The commissary explained that nothing was yet known of the plot. The prisoner's papers had been sealed and placed on Villefort's desk. The accused was named Edmond Dantès, a 19- or 20-year-old mate aboard the three-masted Pharaon, trading in cotton between Alexandria and Smyrna, and belonging to Morel and son of Marseilles. Before entering the merchant service, he had never served in the Navy. As Villefort reached the corner of the Rue de Conseils, a man approached who had clearly been waiting. Morel himself. Warmly but with urgency, the shipowner expressed his dismay at the arrest of his young mate, praising Dantès as the most worthy and reliable man he knew and an unmatched seaman in the merchant service. He pleaded for Villefort's indulgence, but Villefort, a staunch royalist of aristocratic standing, looked upon Morel, a man of plebeian birth and suspected Bonapartist sympathies, with cool detachment. In his mind, private virtue and professional skill did not erase the possibility of political crime. His tone carried a weight meant to remind Morel that a man could be both honorable in daily life and dangerous in the eyes of the state. His gaze seemed to probe deeper still, as if suggesting that the one pleading for mercy might himself stand in need of it. Morel flushed, troubled by his own uncertain standing and by what Dantès had told him of a meeting with the Grand Marshal and of the Emperor's words. Yet his voice held earnestness as he urged Villefort to act with fairness and restore the young man to them swiftly. The phrasing struck Villefort's ear as almost revolutionary. It led him to wonder whether Dantès was connected to some secret Carbonari society, recalling that he had been arrested in a tavern alongside several others. Villefort assured the shipowner that his duty would be done with impartiality, that innocence would bring release, but guilt, in such times, could not be allowed to go unpunished without setting a dangerous precedent. And with that thought, he prepared to proceed with the examination. Reaching the doorway of his own home, which stood beside the Palais de Justice, Villefort stepped inside. His greeting to the shipowner outside was distant and cold, leaving the man frozen in place where Villefort had left him moments earlier. The antechamber within was crowded with police agents and gendarmes. At the center stood the prisoner, closely guarded, yet calm, with a faint, confident smile. Without pause, Villefort crossed the room, allowed his eyes to flick briefly toward Dantès, accepted a packet from a gendarme, and disappeared, instructing for the prisoner to be brought in. That swift glance, though brief, told Villefort much. He noted intelligence in the high forehead, courage in the dark eyes and the firm set of the brow, and an openness in the strong lips that revealed bright, even teeth. His first impression was favorable, yet his training had taught him to distrust such impulses. Smothering the stirrings of compassion, he composed his features into a grim, official calm and took his seat at his desk. Moments later, Dantès entered, pale but composed, offering a courteous greeting and scanning the room for a place to sit, as if he were a guest in the salon of Morel. It was then he met Villefort's gaze for the first time, a magistrate's gaze designed to penetrate the thoughts of others while guarding his own. Villefort began examining the papers relating to the prisoner, documents already swollen in volume from an hour of eager, corrupt surveillance. He sought to learn who this young man truly was. Dantès, steady in tone, explained his name, position as mate of the Pharaon, and his age, only 19. When questioned about the moment of his arrest, he revealed it had come during his own wedding celebration. The joy of that moment now, in stark contrast to this dark inquiry, and to the severe expression of the man before him. Villefort could not help but feel the pang of coincidence. He, too, was soon to be married, and here he was summoned from his own happiness to destroy another's. The thought lingered, and he quietly shaped it into a phrase he imagined would sound powerful in conversation later. Continuing, Villefort invited Dantès to give all the information he could. The young man, with a faint smile, warned that his knowledge was limited, but he would answer whatever was asked. When pressed about political loyalties, he explained he had never held political opinions, having lived only for his duties, his father, the shipowner Moral, and the woman he loved, Mercedes. His words, natural and heartfelt, stirred in Villefort a recollection of a plea for leniency he had received earlier from someone who did not even know who the accused was. The magistrate found himself more and more convinced of the young man's innocence. There was in him a warmth that reached even toward his judge, despite the cold formality in return. Villefort considered him noble, already imagining the satisfaction of carrying out a request that would earn him private affection later. His expression brightened, and Dantès, noticing the change, smiled as well. When asked whether he had enemies, Dantès insisted his position in life was too modest for that, though he admitted a hasty temper he tried to control. Villefort reminded him that success, becoming captain so young, and winning the love of a beautiful woman, could provoke jealousy. Dantès acknowledged the possibility, but preferred not to know if such people existed, as it would force him to hate them. Villefort countered that one should always see clearly, and even offered to help discover the author of the anonymous accusation. Producing a letter, he asked if the handwriting was familiar. Dantès studied it. He did not recognize it, but observed the writer's skill, calling the author a true enemy, and feeling fortunate to be examined by someone like Villefort. The magistrate then asked him to answer plainly about the truth of the accusations. Dantès swore there was none, offering to tell the full story. He recounted how, after leaving Naples, Captain Leclerc had been struck by brain fever. Determined to reach Elba without stopping at any other port, the captain's illness worsened until, sensing death near, he entrusted Dantès with a task of the greatest importance: to assume command, sail to the island, and deliver a letter to the Grand Marshal. Leclerc gave him a ring that would secure an audience, and within hours was delirious. By the next day, he had died. Dantès explained that he had fulfilled the request exactly as given. Upon arrival, he kept the crew aboard and went ashore alone, gaining entry to the Grand Marshal through the captain's ring. He was questioned about Leclerc's death, and was then entrusted with another letter to deliver to someone in Paris. After returning to port, he tended to the ship's affairs and went to see his bride-to-be. All preparations were completed, and he had been at his wedding feast when arrested, planning to leave for Paris the next day. Villefort acknowledged the account as likely true, calling it an act of obedience rather than guilt, and promised freedom if Dantès surrendered the letter and pledged to appear when summoned. Dantès replied that the letter had already been taken from him and was in a packet on the desk. Villefort asked to whom it was addressed. When Dantès answered, naming Monsieur Noirtier of Rue Coquerin in Paris, Villefort was visibly shaken. His face grew pale as he repeated the name under his breath, staring at the letter in his hand. To Dantès' question of whether he knew this man, Villefort coldly replied that a loyal servant of the king did not know conspirators. The moment Dantès realized that freedom was slipping away again, a fresh wave of fear rose within him. Only moments before, he had felt the relief of release. Now, suspicion and uncertainty pressed down heavily. Villefort reminded him that he had known the name on the letter's address, and Dantès explained that reading it had been necessary to deliver it correctly. The magistrate's face grew even paler as he pressed further, asking if the letter had been shown to anyone. Dantès assured him that no one knew of it, except, of course, the person who had given it to him. Villefort muttered that even this was far too much. His brow darkened, his lips tightened, and his jaw clenched, filling Dantès with uneasy apprehension. After reading the letter once more, Villefort covered his face in his hands. Dantès, speaking cautiously, asked what troubled him, but received no reply. Instead, Villefort raised his head, read the letter again, and questioned whether the young man truly remained ignorant of its contents. Dantès gave his word of honor, offering even to summon help when Villefort appeared unwell. The magistrate refused sharply, insisting on control of the moment. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken tension. Villefort leaned back, wiping perspiration from his brow, and read the letter for a third time. Within himself, he feared the consequences if Dantès understood its contents, and worse, if the connection between Noirtier and Villefort himself were revealed. His eyes locked onto the young man, searching for any sign of such knowledge. Suddenly, he seemed convinced of something, and Dantès, desperate to be believed, begged for questions to answer. Making a visible effort to steady himself, Villefort admitted that he could not immediately restore the prisoner's liberty as intended. He would first need to consult with higher authority, though his own feelings were clear. Dantès expressed gratitude for the magistrate's kindness, and Villefort explained that the primary charge against him was the letter itself. Moving to the fireplace, he tossed the document into the flames, waiting until it was completely consumed. This act filled Dantès with relief, and Villefort assured him that he could now trust him. He offered not a command, but advice. The prisoner would be kept in the Palais de Justice until evening, and if questioned by anyone else, he must repeat what he had already told Villefort, but never mention the existence of that letter. The young man promised. Villefort stressed that only the two of them now knew it had existed. If asked, Dantès must deny it absolutely, for such denial would be his salvation. Dantès agreed without hesitation, confirming that it was the only letter in his possession. Villefort demanded an oath, and Dantès swore it. The magistrate then summoned a police agent, whispered instructions, and had the prisoner escorted away. Dantès offered a respectful salute before departing. The moment the door closed, Villefort collapsed into a chair, pale and shaken. He murmured to himself that had the procureur been present in Marseilles, he would have been utterly ruined. The cursed letter would have shattered all his ambitions. The shadow of his father's past loomed once again over his own future. But then, a sudden thought transformed his expression. A faint, calculating smile appeared, and his eyes gleamed with resolve. From the very letter that could have destroyed him, he would forge his own fortune. Assured the prisoner was gone, he left quickly, heading to the home of his betrothed, his mind already turning to the work ahead.